to another episode of the Exceptional Leadership Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Matt Hamilton. Delighted to have your company with me for a discussion on the question today of, is leading women different to leading men? And I suspect your thoughts on that question are going to be heavily influenced by your personal lived experience. What prompted me to do an episode on this topic today is the recollection of a conversation that I had with a woman years ago where we were chatting away, and she noted that the majority of my team comprised of women, and she asked me if I found that more difficult than leading a more balanced team or a team comprised of more men. And the question took me back a little bit at the time. I was a little taken aback by it because I hadn't really thought about it in any great detail. And it provides an interesting topic of conversation. So what we'll do before we get into the body of the podcast and discuss the differences, or whether indeed there are any that might impact us from a leadership perspective, we'll go over the key areas where women and men differ from a psychological perspective in a general sense. Now, this is just some information that I've pulled up from doing some relatively brief research online. So I'm not reading through academic papers here, but nevertheless, it provides an interesting set of general fundamental differences that have been observed between men and women. So the first is emotional expression and regulation. See if this rings true to you. So according to this source, women tend to be more emotionally expressive and are often more attuned to their emotions. They might experience emotions more intensely and are more likely to share their feelings in an open fashion. Men, on the other hand, are generally socialized to suppress emotional expression, especially emotions like sadness or fear, due to traditional gender norms. They may express emotions like anger more readily and often have a tendency to manage emotions internally rather than outwardly. The second key difference is in the empathy and social sensitivity sphere. Women, according to researchers, are generally more empathetic and attuned to the emotions of others. They tend to show higher levels of empathy and emotional intelligence, which helps in building close interpersonal relationships. Men, on the other hand, may display empathy in a different way, often through actions. An example of that could be helping others in a practical way, but they might not always express emotional sensitivity with the same technique or in the same manner as women. Then we move on to cognitive styles. So according to this source, women tend to have stronger verbal communication skills, are generally better at multitasking, and have a greater ability to focus on emotional cues in social situations. Men, on the other hand, are thought to often show some superior spatial and mathematical reasoning skills and may prefer linear thinking. They might also be more focused on one task at a time rather than multitasking. The fourth is communication styles. Women tend to use communication as a tool for building relationships, emphasizing connection and seeking support. They're often more verbal about their emotions and may place higher value on the quality of the interaction. Men, on the other hand, often use communication to establish dominance, convey information, or solve problems. Their communication style might be more direct and solution focused. That is an interesting one. Communication styles. Then we move on to social bonds and relationships. So according to this source, women are generally people who place higher emphasis on social bonds and relationships, often maintaining close-knit friendships and valuing emotional support within these connections. Men, on the other hand, may form strong bonds too, but they're often based on shared activities such as sports or hobbies. Men may also have a smaller but often more competitive circle of friends. Then we have stress response, which as a leader is of specific interest to us amongst our team members. So according to this, women under stress are more likely to engage in what's termed as a tend and befriend behaviour style, seeking social support and nurturing relationships to cope with stress. This may be influenced by the hormone oxytocin, which is more pronounced in women than men. Now, men often respond to stress with a fight or flight response, seeking to resolve the stress by either taking action or withdrawing. This response is often linked to higher levels of testosterone, according to this source. Then finally, brain structure and function. So studies suggest that women's brains are more active in areas related to verbal processing, memory, and emotional regulation. And women also tend to have larger hippocampus, which is related to memory and emotional processing. Men, on the other hand, tend to have larger amygdalas, which is associated with processing emotions like fear and aggression. And they also show higher activity in the areas related to spatial processing. Spatial spelled S-P-A-T-I-A-L. Now, the conclusion, according to this source, of all that is that while there are psychological differences on average between men and women, it is essential to understand that these differences exist along a spectrum. Individual experiences, personal interests, and social influences play a significant role in shaping psychological traits. Gender differences are also becoming less rigid over time as societal expectations and norms evolve. And I think that clarification at the end there, which notes that we need to understand that this is a spectrum, I think that's very appropriate, because there are a couple that I read through in there which I must admit probably did seem a little bit generalised to me. Especially the one that stood out for me was the communication styles. We read that women tend to use communication as a tool for building relationships and emphasising connection, whereas men were essentially painted as, really just a binary sort of exchange of information. Men were painted as, being people who really only use communication to establish dominance, convey information, or solve problems. I know certainly on a personal level, I communicate with a heck of a lot more intention than that, and I like to think I'm pretty good at communicating in ways that are good for building relationships and emphasising connection. Not only seeking support, but also offering support to friends that are in need. So I definitely agree that it is a spectrum that we all exist on. But with that groundwork laid, let's get into some initial thoughts on this topic. So the first observation that I have, and had actually, when this lady asked me if it was more difficult for me to lead women than men, the first thought that came to mind is that as humans, we love to generalise, don't we? We love our, generalise sort of statements. It's easy, it doesn't require much thought. Oftentimes it doesn't have to be based on any solid information, but it is also intrinsically tied to our lived experience, which unfortunately doesn't tend to acknowledge the fact that there is some nuance at play in just about every situation. And I think it goes both ways with respect to stereotypes. What we just read through there were essentially stereotypes. Stereotypes are generalizations. And it's certainly inaccurate, I think, to suggest that no stereotypes are true. We all know men who are hyper-aggressive, hyper-competitive, and fit every single one of those general traits that you would associate with men. On the flip side, we also, I'm sure, have all known many women who are perhaps overly emotional, indecisive, so on and so forth. All of those general traits that people will traditionally associate with women. But what I think is really interesting is the human element. The human element is not what's accounted for when we start talking about stereotypes. What I mean by human element, what I mean is we need to account for things like motivation, temperament, intelligence, so on and so forth, and understand that they're not exclusive to one sex. And the reason they're not exclusive to one sex is because we cannot discount the importance of nurture over nature. What do I mean by the differences between nurture and nature? So the detail that we just discussed there, as in the differences between men and women in a general sense, they're all nature aspects, i.e., your tendencies, just by the very nature of the fact that you are a man or you are a woman. You're born with it, so to speak. And of course, there are differences between the two. But we cannot discount the radical impact that shapes us. We are shaped through our nurture, okay? The way that we're brought up, our early formative experiences as children, as young adults, when it comes to, for example, leadership, maybe a good thing to focus on as an example from a nurture perspective is if you're the oldest sibling in a large family, whether you are male or female, you are likely to have been called upon in that situation by your parents to take on additional responsibility and contribute in a way that really mirrors leadership through that additional responsibility to help your parents care for your brothers and sisters. And that is a great example of a nurture factor that would potentially help shape you into a specific personality type later in life, and perhaps one that is more suited for leadership. So we need to acknowledge, yes, there are differences from a nature sort of perspective between men and women, but we absolutely cannot discount the critical role that the nurture aspect plays. How are you raised? What are your foundational shaping experiences as a young person that have helped turn you into what you are today? So from a personal experience, as I mentioned, you guys will have your own view on this from a personal experience perspective, but I've had literally all types of personalities across both sexes. I've had men that are borderline hysterical from an emotional perspective. Men who would come into work one day, be the nicest people that you've ever met, and then the very next day would be a night and day image of the person that they were before. Highly emotional, highly stressed, highly disagreeable, just all over the shop emotionally. On the other hand, I've had women who have been the complete opposite of that. Stoic, level, balanced, very, very good at having frank and direct conversations, but not in a way that is going to offend or come across as overly aggressive. Traits that if you were to read the information source that we began the podcast with, you would traditionally associate with masculinity. So I've seen both ends of the spectrum flipped on its head and experienced everything in between. And that possibly is why I was a little surprised when the lady that I spoke about at the beginning of the podcast asked me that question of, do you find women more difficult to lead? Interesting conversation nonetheless. So I do think, however, and this is a spectrum as well, but I do think I notice a difference in the type of energy in a general sense that is put out by a almost exclusively male workforce versus an almost exclusively female workforce. And I am a fan of getting a little bit of balance in the office to steady that energy and obtain the best of both worlds in one place. It seems to, and maybe this is just, my experience. You guys could have a completely different understanding or experience yourselves, I'm not sure. But, the whole time that I have been involved in business and workplaces, I've noticed that it tends to be a better workplace when you've got a balancing out of those energies. You don't want too much female energy, you don't want too much male energy. It's nice to sort of fall somewhere in between and get the benefits of both. That's just my personal experience. I've always felt that they have been the workplaces that have felt the best. So that gets us into, the topic of things like diversity. Diversity is a real buzzword these days. You'll hear it in every, HR presentation. You'll see it in every company advert for a role. Everybody focuses on diversity in the workplace, fair hiring practices, so on and so forth. And I think we need to understand that because it's a buzzword, the onus is on us as leaders to be very clear about what we mean by diversity. There are so many different facets to diversity. Are you talking about gender diversity? Are you talking about neurodiversity, as in the way that people think? Are you talking about skill set diversity? Are you talking about work task diversity? Diversity means a lot of different things if you break it down to those areas, those subsections that might fall under that word. What I will say is that if we are trying to achieve a balance in the workplace from a gender perspective, I'm of the view that we cannot do that if we are compromising skill set. You absolutely have to prioritize competence over gender balance, and I am really firm on that. I will not hire someone simply because they are a male or simply because they are a female, and we need to get a balance in shape. I am going to hire every single time based on competence as the number one thing, and then if we happen to have a nice balance from a sex perspective after that, between male and females in the workplace, then that's a bonus. But it's not something that I'm willing to prioritize over skill set. We must make sure that we have the very best talent available in the workplace to get the job done to the best of our ability. So that is something that I will say. There are significant differences when it comes to things like family issues. All right, this is something that as a leader you need to take into account. When you have a healthy contingent of women in the workforce, you are going to have to understand as a leader that there will be other things required of you to manage that are purely down to that nature aspect that we talked about, which is obviously things like pregnancy and all the things that come with that. So for example, you will most likely have to arrange maternity backfill and cover for your employee when she goes off and has a baby. And that is usually for quite a significant period of time. It introduces some complexities and nuances to your equation because you're going to have to source someone to backfill that role. You won't be able to offer it to them full-time permanently because the individual that is giving birth will come back and has a right to come back to their substantive role. So you will have to find someone who is willing to work on a contract basis. It is more difficult to find people who will fill positions like that are only contracted for a short period of time, and by that I mean under 2 years while you cover for that maternity backfill. And the reason for that is that people obviously want security and certainty when it comes to employment. So if they have the choice between taking a contract role or taking a full-time permanent role, they're going to take the full-time permanent role most times. Why wouldn't you? It makes sense. So as a hiring manager, there are some complexities that you're going to have to allow for when it comes to managing a female workforce or a workforce that has a healthy contingent of women in it. On the other end of that spectrum, when your employee comes back to the workplace, you will have to manage her transition back into full-time work in a very careful, consultative and compassionate manner, because when someone's been off work for a year and a half, as you can essentially do under certainly the organisation that I work for, the maternity provisions are pretty generous. As a woman, you can be off work for a really significant period of time before you come back. And that often comes with a bit of anxiety. You've now got this person that has been backfilling for you, established in the organization. You might have a bit of insecurity around whether you're, being replaced, whether, that person does a better job than you, and, whether your colleagues are, going to like this person better. All these human things that it is natural and normal for someone to experience from an anxiety perspective will, at least possibly, be at play. Aside from that, there's also just the general, I like to call work fitness. If you haven't worked full time for a year and a half, it is mentally taxing to get back into that routine and be in a workplace 8 hours a day. Couple that with the fact that, our mums have to then go and do things like school pickups and drop-offs and, be highly dependent upon at home, you can see how it's a bit of an intense mix with respect to fatigue and responsibility and all that sort of stuff. So we need to understand that those differences between men and women are probably most apparent when it comes to family, and all the issues around that need to be managed as a manager. I will say that I think that is probably an area where, as a male, I have realised that I can only relate to so much. And what I've often sought to do is make sure that I get a senior female presence in the room with respect to those return to work meetings, so that, if I've got an employee who is a female and she's navigating all of this stuff, I think it helps if I can get a female colleague, perhaps from HR, for example, to help me manage that return to work process, so that at least I've got all bases covered. It's not just a male perspective in there. There is a female perspective from someone who's done it before, someone who understands the sensitivities, and that helps me to make sure that all my bases are covered and I can lead in the most compassionate and understanding manner possible and learn through that process myself. So that's something to understand as well. Be introspective enough to understand that your lived experience might mean that you are only able to partially relate to the topic that you are navigating with your female employee in this case. So it's a bit of an interesting and nuanced area. So what are some actionable items on this topic? The first is that I would suggest we don't assume. We have these stereotypical attitudes about men and women and what their personalities are more likely to be at a general level. As I said, and as I'm sure you've experienced, I have had all ends of the spectrum. I've had women who are very, very decisive and really together from a logical and emotional perspective. I've had women who are definitely not like that and who are all over the shop from an emotional perspective. But I've also had those things in men as well. So I've never really been able to get a general, assurance that the person I'm dealing with is going to behave in a certain way simply because they're a man or they're a woman. I've definitely come to appreciate that it's a spectrum, and you can have all sorts regardless. You'll also have to bear in mind that you will encounter variations across all employees, regardless of whether they're men or women. But what you need to do is, instead of focusing on gender, you need to focus on what their personality type is. So look for their strengths, look for their advantages, and take the gender equation out of it. Just focus on the skill sets. Focus on the advantages and disadvantages that person's skill sets and work experience bring to the equation, and then tailor your approach accordingly would be my advice. Guys, I'm really interested to hear from you actually on this topic. Maybe you can hit up the show on the send us a text link that you'll find in the show notes. I really would like to hear your experience as to how you've found it. Maybe you're a woman leading a team that is almost exclusively men, and maybe that has come with some really unique challenges for you to navigate as a woman. Maybe you felt that you've had to work harder to earn the respect because perhaps there are some baked-in views in the male workforce, particularly in gentlemen that might be of an older age group. That is something that I say because I've spoken to women who have relayed to me those experiences. Very interesting. Or maybe like me, you've been in charge of a team that consists of predominantly women, and that has left you feeling a little bit out of your depth with respect to things like maternity leave and managing return to work processes when it comes to post-childbirth situations. It's a really interesting thing, but discussing this stuff makes us better leaders. Experiencing these things makes us better leaders, makes us capable of leading in a broader setting. Interesting conversation. So hit us up using the send us a text link in the show notes and let me know what your experience has been. And while you're there, hit up the 2 links that I've also got in the show notes for the LinkedIn Community of Practice page and the Instagram account for the show. If you want to consume things like reels and posts and see a little bit more content that you won't get just from listening to the podcast alone, hit that link and follow the show on Instagram. It'd be really, really good to build up a bit of a social media following. I'm also considering doing a book giveaway in the next couple of months. So you might want to get on board, follow the Instagram page so that you don't miss out on the opportunity to win a prize, probably a book, that is going to be dealing with something relevant to leadership. I need to have a think about what that book will be. I've read a lot of really good ones, and I've got a few that I think would really benefit you guys from a further education perspective. So jump on to the Instagram link in the show notes and make sure you follow the show. And also the LinkedIn page, the Exceptional Leadership Community of Practice page. The theory behind starting that is that essentially all the listeners of the show can join that group and we can share ideas amongst each other, basically, and learn from each other. I've also got a few of my contacts as a part of that group as well. So it is a good opportunity to network as well, which is always nice. Finally, in closing, guys, make sure you subscribe to the show on whatever podcast app you consume the show on. That is really important. And also, if you're feeling really generous, leave us a 5-star review. And tell a friend if you think that they could do with a little bit of education around leadership. Tell them about this podcast, share it, spread the word, and together we'll see if we can get the standard of leadership up to where it should be. All right, guys, until next time, I'll see you later.